Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar. My name is Esther Romeyn. I'm a professor at the UF Center for European Studies. The UF Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center for Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. We are a multidisciplinary area and language studies center. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for a talk entitled Ontological Insecurity in International Relations, Examples from Europe. It is a talk that is part of the European Studies Because series, and our speakers today are Dr. Maria Mälksoo and Dr. Jennifer Mitzen. Dr. Mälksoo is Professor of International Relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. She is the principal investigator of the European Research Council funded Ritual Deterrence Project and serves as an associate editor for the Review of International Studies. And her research foci are critical security studies, memory politics, political anthropology, and the politics of deterrence, with an imperial focus on NATO's eastern flank. Jennifer Mitzen is Professor of Political Science at Ohio State University. Her research interests lie in international relations theory, security, global governance, and the relationship between theory and international history. Dr. Mitzen's current research project includes research on the phenomenon of unthinkability in world politics, which I think she will touch upon in her talk. She is the author of Power in Concert, the 19th Century Origins of Global Governance, and she has published widely on ontological security, including as co-editor of Ontological Insecurity in the European Union. The way that this webinar is going to be structured, both of the speakers have prepared some information on their research, which they will present on. I think that Jennifer Mitzen is going first, and then there will be plenty of time for question and answers at the end of the talk, and you should have the question answer feature of the webinar to submit your questions. And again, thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the talks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for that kind introduction. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm especially delighted to be presenting with Maria. I always love hearing about Maria's work. I see that the advertisement says, I'm going to share my screen as I'm talking to try to save time. But you can see all of the, I'm just going to leave it in this semi-professional way so that you can see your stuff on the side. The announcement said that I'll be talking about states' foreign policies, but that piece from 2006 or so, I think I can go beyond that by telling you some stuff I've been working on a little bit more recently that might be a little bit more interesting to you. So I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about system trust, which is a centerpiece of a recent article, and I'm going to talk a little bit about unthinkability and apply it to Europe. Okay, so let me start with system trust. In a paper I published in 2022 with my co-author, Mitzen, we developed this concept, system trust. And it refers to a calm confidence or trust that the world will basically continue as it does to exist as it does now. And it's rooted in the idea of basic trust, coined by Anthony Giddens, which is something we all individually have, our calm confidence or trust that the world will continue to exist as it always does. Basic trust operates in the background. It allows us to know who we are as we go about our day-to-day lives, and usually we don't think about it. But when it's shaken and when we can't count on the certainties of our social world, we can become anxious and ontologically insecure. So ontological insecurity is that feeling of personal decoherence, where it feels impossible to act in any way as if you're yourself. And at the social or political level, this profound anxiety and insecurity is linked to a public's vulnerability to politics of fear. Okay, so Mitzen and I asked, to what extent is the state system or the international part of a public's lay-level basic trust? Now, day to day, I don't think about the fact that states are out there in the background as I go about my day-to-day life, but what if I couldn't rely on that? What if I couldn't rely on the international? I didn't think it was there anymore. To what extent, on some level, do I need to know that the state system is out there working as it does? So a lot of people, do I need to trust in it, right? So a lot of people, when they're talking about trust in IR, they talk about interpersonal trust. And interpersonal trust among leaders is a good thing. We want that to happen in world politics. It's good for security. It's good for international order. But the trust that they're talking about is psychological, interpersonal, and it depends on particular people. It starts in our individual heads, and it rests on a certain kind of mechanism. Mitzen and I say that there's another kind of trust, the trust that operates in the background, as I just described. And we rely on folks like Niklas Luhmann and other sociologists to build this concept, which we call system trust. This is trust in the whole, that backgrounded feeling of knowing that the set of basic political and social and moral institutions that shape our everyday life are as they are and will continue to exist in their present form. It's a calm, unobtrusive, natural orientation of expecting the world to go on as we know it. And we say it conditions the meaning and effects of any interpersonal trust that forms in the social world. So sociologists have developed this idea domestically, where system trust is trust in the local social and political institutions. We claim this is true in world politics, that international system trust means trust in continuation of the state system. Now, the analogy to dark matter is helpful. Scientists propose that something like 80% of the matter in the universe is dark matter, matter that can't be seen or measured, but that's important. And the hypothesis they pose is that each star or planet or galaxy has its own velocity and could be traveling around on its own. With dark matter, they stay in roughly the same orbit, roughly the same locale. But if there was not dark matter, then given a bit of time, the order would break down and each would fly off in different ways, like the little red arrows that I made in the bottom. So we propose in that piece that international system trust is the dark matter of world politics. So applied here, this means that international system trust, trusting in the whole, conditions the meaning and effects of interpersonal trust among leaders. And the findings of all IR scholarship on trust rely on assuming system trust. Why should we care about this? Well, if international system trust exists, then if we lose it, is to lose the social dark matter that holds global dynamics in place. There could still be psychological interpersonal trust among political leaders, but it would have a different meaning, different causes, and different effects. And we don't know much about mere interpersonal trust in world politics. Okay, without system trust, mere international interpersonal trust might not be so good for us, for world politics. So we conceptualize it, and I'll just offer a brief sense of how that goes. We developed 3 claims: that it's in the background, that it's macro level, but let me focus on the third. For any social system, trust in the central unit indexes trust in the whole. So when there's a decline of trust in that unit, it indexes a decline in trust in the system. Sociologists use the example of money. For a monetary system to function, members have to treat the currency as if it's money, giving it day to day, without question, the power to represent value. But if enough of them lose confidence in currency as value, then confidence in the whole monetary order disappears and you get financial panic. In other words, trust in the unit, money, indexes trust in the entire system. So we're arguing that in world politics, the state is that unit. The state person is that unit, not just the state as a structure of international authority, but the state acting as a person, an intentional, agentic actor with relationships on the world stage. So state personhood tends to be unobtrusive and in our background, but we use these words all the time to refer to how states talk to each other. And I give a couple examples on here. The US and Britain are friends, Iran holds grudges, suffers humiliation, and so on. The thing is, personhood as an institution is so deep held Even Hedley Bull, the original theorist of international society, doesn't notice state personhood, but his concept society relies on. So our conceptual claim then is that this knee-jerk attribution of personhood that we to these political units is a huge accomplishment that we all do routinely every day, so much so that we've become attached to it. Onto security depends on it. So our conceptualization of that importance of personhood to us has 3 steps. We make the state a person through this fusion. There are psychological advantages of doing so, of benefits. There are psychological benefits psychologists have found of giving complex abstractions in giving them personal qualities. And therefore, this is our move. When we attach personhood to states, we as persons feel more linked to the international order. We can be attached to states being persons and find it very deeply unsettling if that personhood is lost or breached. So when we make that link, treating states as just like us, it links us in our everyday world to the faraway, confusing international. It makes comprehensible what would otherwise be complex, dangerous world politics through frameworks we know and understand from our interpersonal life, like friendship and trust, right? That's the centerpiece of the paper. There is such a thing as international system trust, indexed through our trust every day that the state is like a person. So I'll end by just giving a sense of the implications of this idea that international trust is not just an interpersonal thing. It matters for political reasons. Consider the counterfactual. But for international system trust, leaders' trust with each other is merely interpersonal. And that is not necessarily stabilizing. It's just people with lots of power doing favors for each other based on their personal meetings of the minds. And that can cause all sorts of problems. One I want to highlight and this part of my talk on is this. These days, the international system trust appears to be unstable and declining. There's mistrust of particular state leaders, of parties, the parties they represent, of the party system overall. And there's widespread delegitimation of the state as a political form from several directions. Can states protect their people against economic globalization? Is the globalist deep state undermining real citizens' lives? Does sovereignty as we know it seal in hierarchical legacies of colonial empire? And what I mean to show there is that these criticisms come from right, left, and center. The combined effect is to destabilize trust in the state form. Early scholars at domestic level warn that declines in system trust prompt a greater need for interpersonal trust. But in modern society, interpersonal trust is hard. It's among strangers. So they predicted that people will fall to simple rules for trusting, in-group trust and out-group distrust or othering. So low system trust can make publics, scaling that up, vulnerable to politics of fear and to falling for charismatic, personalistic leaders that offer a promise of stability. So in other words, take away system trust like taking away dark matter, and the international system works differently. A mechanism, trust, that can be stabilizing actually becomes destabilizing. So our point is that we need to pay attention to what's going on in the background. All right, now that I've made us all very afraid, let me turn to unthinkability, the second set of ideas that I've been working with that are related to an outgrowth of ontological security. Around 10 years ago in 2016, I published an article on the topic of unthinkability that was meant to be, it was commissioned to be a review essay on the theme of the rhetoric of national security. But as I collected literature on that topic, there was this one word that kept coming up when in the context of national security rhetoric, and it was unthinkable. It's used in a lot of different ways in IR and policy communities, but everyone who uses it is interested in national security broadly understood. So I thought examining this phrase might take us to neat places. And I published, this was, I think, when I met Maria for the first time, but working together on this special issue in which my article was anxious community, the EU as insecurity community. And now I'm expanding those ideas into a book. So let me begin and just give you a sense of this idea. The word, when I looked backwards in historically, is first used, unthinkable is first used in the 19th century, and it's associated with Herbert Spencer, a kind of normatively problematic individual, the author of Social Darwinism. But he was a really prominent political philosopher at the time, and his doctrine of the unknowable got a lot of attention. His argument was that humans have no access to true reality. Religion and science offer false gods. Neither offers access to this thing we cannot get, which is truth and meaning. And in the commentary that followed, there was great fear that Spencer's unknowable, if widely held, would displace both stabilizing authorities and be socially and politically quite dangerous. So that was that. Fast forwarding a bit, after World War II, from the 50s on, political uses of the term unthinkable rise tremendously. And they were clustered around three issues in particular: European post-war cooperation, making war unthinkable, and then genocide and nuclear weapons use as unthinkably horrific modes of mass killing. So in the book, what I do is I first develop a social theory of unthinkability, and then I apply it to the post-World War II case. In the social theory, what I do is I unpack the phenomenon of unthinkability, relying on two metrics to get at the what is thinkable in a society. And one metric is availability, whether, and it's an empirical question of whether an idea is out there, the availability of an idea. And then there's the acceptability of the idea, which is the normative question, whether a society considers an idea good or acceptable. So I take those as two distinct sets of unthinkability and thinkability, and they're worth separating. So let me just define them for a minute. The empirical dimension of whether something is thinkable. There are ideas we talk about all the time in conversation that we engage with, we refer to, we reflect on. Then there's this ideas that don't come up in a particular conversation, they just might not be articulated. And then there's ideas that are embedded in our practices, but we don't say at all, right? Now there's a continuum then from really salient ideas to things that aren't said to things that are not entertained. Now the fact that some knowledge is not available to our conscious mind in every conversation, even if it's in our habits and practices, is important both for cognitive reasons, we can't think of everything all the time, and for emotional reasons. And this is the ontosecurity link. Practices and habits, they give us ontological security. They form the basis of our basic trust in the world around us. So making some ideas unavailable to our conscious mind is another way of thinking about the cognitive cocoon through which we know and feel comfortable in the world. So pulling this together, availability, some ideas are articulated, others would require some social work to bring into conscious awareness, and that taps into ontosecurity. The other parameter is acceptability, the normative dimension. These are ideas that a society condemns or condones, right? The latter condemning through stigmatization or taboo or even repression. There's a continuum from explicit agreement to social consensus that something is right or wrong, to ideas that are embedded in our persistent practices and considered legitimate, to things that are explicitly disapproved of, ridiculed, scoffed at, or things that are so repugnant to our conscious mind that they are held back behind it, sort of Herbert Spencer's. Both cognition and affect are along this metric as well. Taboos and stigmas and repressed ideas are associated with profound affect, revulsion, and disgust, or even a kind of a repressed desire in the case of repression. So I wanted to make these into a 2x2, which I do here. I dichotomize them into dichotomous variables instead of continuous. So availability is articulable and sayable in the one hand, to ranging down to unavailable, unarticulated common sense in the other. Those are unavailable ideas. And I've dichotomized acceptability into legitimate and or unquestioned versus unaccepted, which encompasses a range from routinely, widely disagreed and disapproved of, to the ideas, expression of which inspire revulsion, disgust, and so on. The intersection of these is these four varieties of unthinkability, and my proposition is that what's thinkable and unthinkable in society is represented. This is sort of a status quo of the society. The left column gives us a sense of what is and can be debated in the public sphere. The available and acceptable ideas are talked about. The unavailable, acceptable ideas are the things that are the premises that we don't even think about. So for example, just a quick example would be genocide. We talk about genocide. Genocide is a horrible thing. We talk about a range of acceptable, legitimate versus illegitimate thinking. What's been unavailable for a very long time in genocide discourse was the idea that colonial empires committed genocide in the process of colonizing, right? So that was, for a long time, the common sense of genocide did not permit colonial violence to be called genocide. Then it became thematized, and now it's entering the conversation. But that's to give you a sense of unavailable, unarticulated common sense. In a while. Okay, so the right, that's the left-hand column. The right-hand column gives a sense of what's normatively off limits in a society. Available but unacceptable ideas that are kind of the things that are considered wrong. Like I use the genocide case, genocide as the taboo behavior would be one of them. And then way down in the bottom, unavailable and unacceptable is an especially interesting category. These are ideas that resist being brought to consciousness and represented. And that taps into, I say, Spencer's unknowable, and that it courts the boundaries of our moral order and things we can think about and still think of ourselves as moral human beings. Okay, that's a really quick summary. The case study that I apply it to is the post-war order, because at the end of World War II, we formed for the first time a universal moral community. And it was made universal around this idea of things being morally unthinkable. The moral core is to abhor these three forms of unthinkable violence: European war, genocide, and nuclear weapons use. So the post-war politics, I argue, reflects a politics of managing unthinkability in a way that can preserve this universal morality or moral glue. That's my argument of the book. But I want to end by giving you a flavor of the anxious community argument in my last minute. So in my 2018 piece, I applied that idea of unthinkability specifically to EU governance, specifically in light of the migration crisis. And so I'll quickly summarize that. EU is anxious community. I argued that the politics of migration governance, or the relative lack of political engagement at the EU level, reveal anxiety at the core of EU identity as a post-Westphalian normative power. This special identity on the world stage rests partly on an ability to erase the possibility of war among member states, which it does through largely apolitical, bureaucratized cooperative routines. So it takes this novel hybrid institutional shape, and it has this novel autobiographical narrative, a novel normative identity. But the cultural field in which the politics are practiced has not adapted to the novel political form. Instead, I argue that European governance practices delegitimate political, while the cultural repertoire and security affairs consists of, consists of primitive modes of political reaction, othering, and taboo. An adaptive policy response to migration would be to desecuritize it and link it to EU values and institutions. But desecuritization amounts to politicization, and the EU lacks mechanisms for handling political disagreement. And that, I argue in that 2018 piece, can help account for the inability to politically engage the migrant. So let me sum up by saying that in this piece, the core European self-identity as something to be proud of rests on moral opprobrium of European war. War is unthinkable. But the mode of organizing violence, nonviolence, tells us something about the practice of that identity coherence, namely that the morality entails a permissiveness or even legitimation of some other violence to the non-European other. That's the end of that. And I really want to thank you again for the invitation and the opportunity to share my research with you. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. That was a lot to digest, but very, very provocative. We're going now to Maria Mälksoo. I'll give her the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I hope you can see my slides. Excellent. And it was very interesting. It's also good that Jennifer already covered so broad ground, tapping into some of the key concepts of also ontological security studies. No wonder, considering that she's one of the first introducers of the concept to the field in international relations. But Jennifer spoke about practices, habits, tacit knowledge, trust, fundamentally. I'm going to situate some of my work in the realm of the politics of memory against state stories or state autobiographical narratives, which is something that is also very much part and parcel of the ontological security studies vocabulary, because, of course, not only at the individual level, we also think of memory as a temporal backbone for collective autobiographies, and states just as well as us as individuals tell stories about themselves. They do that through education, of course, through their museums and various commemorative practices and structures, memorialization structures. But they also do that through the means of law. And this is something I have been studying in my recent pertinent work. And I'm gonna simply touch upon some of the bits and pieces of that. So there are some questions that this work speaks to. Probably I will not be able to go in significant detail into all of these questions, but I guess the core question when we think of memory and law is, why would states even reach for the means of law to defend their historical memory at times? And what else is being done? What do they do when they actually say by means of law that someone has a duty to remember in a particular way, or someone has a right, and this right is prescribed, but someone else's right is also proscribed by way of putting a particular way of remembrance into law. So before I get to some of the recent bits of the related work, I just want to very quickly situate this work, I guess, conceptually in how we can even speak about memory and whose memory, because these are the crucial questions that, of course, also ontological security studies, particularly now, continue to discuss and debate. Jennifer touched upon the state personhood question. This remains one of the big bones of contention among the critiques of ontological security concept and ontological security studies. But I guess when I situate my own work against the backdrop of these questions, then I think I'm unashamedly or have been unashamedly following the Giddinsian wean, in the sense that actually states are interesting objects to analyze when we think of how they seek to defend themselves. And when we talk about memory laws in particular, I guess the interesting bit is how they not only express these selves, how they not only perform these selves, but actually also seek to police the legitimate public discourse about how they can be spoken about, how their memory can be referred to, how their past can be even spoken about. And this is where what becomes particularly interesting is this subject matter of punitive memory laws, of which I will say more about in an instant. But I think maybe here 2 points are worthwhile to be reiterated when we talk about memory and ontological security. And these are memory and identity nexus and memory and security nexus here. And particularly when we talk about remembering as something that is being done in groups when societies remember, and when we talk about collective memory or some other epithet that refers to remembering being done not just individually, and this referring to something that is more than our personal experiential individual memory. It's also about constitution of these groups in the act or in the process of remembering, as the American sociologist of memory, Jeffrey Olick, has so compellingly put it. And of course, when we talk about doing remembering by states, and particularly when this remembering happens in the relations between former perpetrator and former victim states, broadly speaking, obviously these lines do not neatly run only along the state lines, because they also run through and across societies. And that is, of course, why we also need to pay attention to individual responsibilities there. But basically, this is something where this problem of how states practice remembering, be it through the commemorative practices or through memory laws, particularly punitive memory laws, where it becomes the problem for international relations. As another American international relations scholar, Jennifer Lind, has discussed in the context of public apologies for past atrocities, historical crimes, generally states that deny their past violence appear to the others, particularly the formerly victimized states, to have hostile intentions, and hence also be read as continuingly hostile. Now, very quickly, continuing on this conceptual brush clearing stint, some terms that might be partly perhaps overlapping, certainly are derivate terms of ontological security when it comes to expanding this notion and this conceptual baggage to the realm of studying memory. Mnemonical security, something that I suggested back in perhaps 2015, which again is something that very much emerged as an idea in the context of punitive memory policing through memory laws that actually have attached to them, or that actually entail specific stipulations about punishments when a certain rule is overstepped or not followed. And then there is the concept which is related but not exactly the same, by a fellow scholar who has connected ontological security and memory, specifically Austrian scholar Katrin Bachleitner, who has suggested this notion of temporal security, specifically taking this idea of ontological security as a search for this continuous sense of self and continuous also self story in a way, in relation to a significant historical other from the state's or society's own past. And she has done that in the context of Nazi Germany and Austria, two former Nazi perpetrator states, adopting actually different courses of action on the basis of certain state identity that built on that memory of either being a perpetrator or being an innocent victim, and enacting that identity out differently in the context of the Middle Eastern crisis of the late 1960s and 1970s. Now, let me tell a little bit about the recent research and how I have, with various sets of colleagues, sought to push it further from these initial conceptual probe. And this pertains to the question of international politics of domestic memory laws, because a very legitimate question that any lawyer would ask would be, okay, I mean, this might have some expressive value, what memory laws that seek to punish and seek to also draw these boundaries of the self more broadly than the current state boundaries are. But there is no jurisdiction. So what are we even talking about here? What is the international dimension of domestic memory laws? But I think it's actually interesting and helpful to acknowledge and recognize that punitive memory laws, among these expressive and performative things that they do identity-wise, they also actually constitute the continuation of the politics and logics of deterrence in the sphere of memory politics. They can threaten. They can express very explicit coercive threats, and they can stipulate punishments in case there is disobedience. And of course, the example, and I'll get to that example in a moment, that we have studied most recently, is the example of Russia, which also has quite a long list of these punitive memory laws, which more or less explicitly pertain and suggest that the community that should listen is not just the community of the Russian Federation. There is a pretty multi-level signaling in deterrence theory terms that is going on there. So in a way, such memory laws, I would suggest, also actually function as devices of deterrence in states' international memory politics, or if you will, in the national and international ontological security politics of the states. And some of the pieces and the projects in the framework of which we have studied comparatively how memory laws in different countries seek to do that. The Democracy Project, I put these instances of the recent work out there. Basically, we have studied cases with an emphasis on Eastern Europe, where this sort of identity rule and identity expression fundamentally happens through such memory laws, which have been significantly more punitive in case of Russia and more perhaps declaratory in some other cases. But still, there are instances of other punitive memory laws also in other cases of Central Eastern Europe. And then there is this piece, a recent piece that I penned together with my colleague Karl Gustafsson from Stockholm University, which specifically deals with this idea of memory political deterrence, and of course also tries to, in a way, interweave some of the ideas from the aforementioned Democracy Project and the other project that I'm currently working on, and that Jennifer is also a part of, the Ritual Deterrence Project. And I'll flag here just this collective fruit of our labor, which is a forthcoming edited volume on the politics of memory laws. Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. So we have the pretty in-depth digging on Russian memory laws and policies through the effectively post-Cold War era, but with the intensification in the context of the Russia-Ukrainian war, of course. Then ditto for the Ukrainian memory laws, then the regional states, and then the broader European context and backdrop. And I just quickly want to illustrate some of these points with, the obvious elephant in this room and in this book, which is about the sort of ontological security reading of the reasons, perhaps also the religious fervor with which we have seen Russia going against Ukraine and, continuing to do so. And perhaps, one could also turn it around and find pretty good ontological security explanations in understanding why Ukrainians have been so vehement in resisting, and perhaps so surprisingly so for many, not just in Russia, but also in the West, considering the traditional power imbalances in favor of Russia, actually. And what we see here, and I would say we see this pretty evocatively in this infamous Vladimir Putin's article that was published in 2021, and that many now cite as a core instance of basically genocidal rhetoric and incitement to genocide. Which is the case that Russia's president made for the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians, one people belonging together. Of course, also, Belarusians would be part of this idea because of this historical conception of tripartite or triune Russian nation. So they share a common heritage, but they also share a common destiny, meaning that they cannot diverge in the modern world. So what we see here, and what we fundamentally see at stake also in the logic or building the rationale for the aggression, for the full-scale aggression on part of Russian leadership towards Ukraine, is this logic of Russian brand of imperial nationalism. So in a way, the idea that the Russian self cannot be full, wholesome, and secure in entirety if it isn't together, and obviously this togetherness is to be defined in Russia's terms with Ukraine and with Ukrainians. So this ontological security-centric interpretation actually helps us to understand the attempted recolonization of Ukraine with a full-scale invasion, because the younger brother, return to the embrace of the older brother is fundamentally part of this logic of the Putin regime peddled Russian state story. And of course, there is a whole lot of historical myth-making happening there. And we don't have really time to go into that myth-making. For that, I hope you will be able to consult this book, which will be also open access, and hence it will be easily accessible. But perhaps I should say here that obviously we can think of these memory laws in a way as a, in quotation marks, of course, as a crown jewel, or as a sort of culmination of a certain memory securitization, as well as the deterrence logic by means of various memory political devices. Political rhetoric, diplomatic pressure, these would all be part and parcel of how memory political deterrence can also unfold. But just to give a quick instance of how this instrumentalization and distortion of the past has been very much part of the way of putting such a state story in action by Putin and also some of his coterie in the context of this particular aggression. I think what is interesting here is this sort of concurrent use of some of the key tropes that also go back to an earlier context and to an earlier sort of past chargedness as mnemonical devices, such as denazification and decommunization in the same breath, right? So on the one hand, that would be this idea that, well, you know, Ukraine is a Nazi state, it needs to be denazified, meaning de-Ukrainianized. But then also there is this curious trope of simultaneously it has to be decommunized, which of course plays with this idea of what, you know, Ukraine in its memory political emancipation attempt tried to do by sort of getting rid of the Soviet heritage and monuments and street names as part of the decommunization campaign, also with the decommunization laws. But Putin went back and jokingly referred to the idea that, well, you know, considering that modern Ukraine was actually the creation of the communists, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, first and foremost, hence the decommunization taken to the logical conclusion would actually mean the dismantling of Ukraine, which of course, you know, gets us to this interesting element in this particular distortion or sort of state mythology making, creative state story telling, which reminds us of this legendary figure from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, Humpty Dumpty. Empty signifier. Everything has become an empty signifier, and of course also a whole lot of mnemonic diffusion happens here. Being conscious of time, I will just very briefly show the sort of gist of this idea of memory political deterrence, so that we would be able to also have some Q&A and discussion. But basically, it builds on the idea that memory laws are securitizing speech acts, or in that sort of frame of understanding, they are declarative deterrentifications. They tell us and by telling us try to set certain boundaries about what cannot be spoken about in a certain way, or what can or cannot be remembered in a certain way. And now when we look at the Russian memory laws in particular, and I'll jump a bit forward here, we'll see that the community that is actually targeted is not sort of narrowly bounded with the Russian state community. It very directly pertains to the broader, you know, former Soviet space, if not even the broader sort of former Warsaw Pact area or the Central Eastern Europe, who should all pay attention to shared histories and actually be aware that there is a criminal punishment foreseen if they go against the Russian state story, which means, you know, in case of, say, Ukraine and the Baltic states, that their historiographies, their state autobiographies are thereby effectively criminalized. Events such as Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or you know, the Nazi and Soviet collaborated crimes against peace. So some instances of these recent legislative acts that have punitive measures that are the kinds of memory laws that we can think of as deterrent devices are here on this slide. And I guess I can simply conclude on, as we do also through these pretty thick empirical plowing through the different contexts, that of course, even if they originally are meant to work as shields, basically defending or somehow protecting these national fragile senses of self and national autobiographies, particular types of memory, particular types of memory laws, such as these punitive, proscriptive memory laws, actually have a very explicit threat-centric logic to them, which also means that they tend to work in effect as deterrence. Politics in general tends to work. There is this continuous regeneration of new insecurity spirals, and this desired ontological / mnemonical security remains somehow unachievable. It remains always out of hand. Instead, in a way, the tensions get regenerated, if not even sharpened. And I'll stop there. If you're interested in the thematic, there is a handbook that has a host of wonderful authors who have covered the ground, including specifically probing this ontological security, memory, politics nexus in their chapters. So I'm putting it out unashamedly for further reading, whoever might be interested. Thanks so very much.
Well, that also was a very intense presentation. You guys really, you girls, women, made us really think. And we have at this point only one question though, which do you guys see the questions on the screen? Do you want to, Jennifer, do you want to take a stab?
Sure. I can answer really quickly just in case it encourages other folks to come in. Thank you for the question, Alexander. Where does system trust come from? Can I provide historical examples? And presupposing states as the main unit, is it applicable to other forms of organization? Well, where does it come from? It's the background of our day-to-day life. It's the way that I'm thinking about a sort of basic trust you're born into it, or it's part of what you're socialized into. And in conceptualizing system trust, what we're trying to get at is sort of the widest circle, right? The farthest out, the most abstract. So sort of you have trust in your family, right? You're the inner circle and close friends, and then sort of taking it out to the widest awareness you have of how the world, day-to-day world functions as it does. I'm not sure if that totally gets it for you, but I guess I would say that sort of in medieval Europe, let's say, I read somewhere that the world you existed in was maybe 70 people over the course of your life. So I would imagine system trust is in sort of the local surroundings and family, and about as far out as you go would be, around the world that organizes those 70 people you encounter in your life. But with the rise of media technology, publicity, and so on, and the rise of the empirical international starting in the 19th century and so on, we become aware that we live in this larger world, which is an international world of states. And that's the particular world I'm interested in. We could also think of, last thing I'll say is we could also think of conflict system trust, which is an idea I'm working with now, thinking about if you're born into a local conflict like Israel-Palestine, you form your subjectivity, your sense of what the world is, how the world works through a kind of taking the conflict as your background. So any interpersonal trust relations that you form in your day-to-day life are formed against the backdrop of taking for granted the naturalized order is one of an occupation and so on. So I hope that addresses your question. And thank you again for asking.
Okay, well, a lot of the attendees that who were at the initially, logged in to the talk had to leave because we sort of overlapping different course times, and a lot of the people who were in attendance were students of mine who had to leave at 12:35. So I'm apologizing for the drop in attendance, but maybe since we have not that many people attending now, we can I can introduce some of my thoughts, especially since I thought this was so clarifying for me personally, because in my own work and in my teaching, I have so many overlapping areas of interest, and but you connect the dots for me. So the class that I was teaching just before the seminar and my students rolled into the webinar from is my Introduction to Refugee Studies class. And I also teach classes on politics of Holocaust memory in the EU. I write about it. And migration studies is another component of my work, of course. Yeah, and I teach a class on emotion and affect and politics. So there is, all these different, sort of pieces of the puzzle. And I'm interested in the new right and the politics of narrative in general, and this idea of changing what we conceive as common sense, and then common sense, as a strategy, to especially in the context of the right, pushing against the constraints imposed by the Second World War order on what can be said and what can be said. So I wonder if you, both of you maybe could talk a little bit about, this, because I was taking that idea of common sense, of course, from Gramsci, and knowing that, the new right uses Gramsci to basically plot its strategies. Change and the way that the strategy of the new right was precisely to culturalize race into culture and to replace Jews and anti-Semitism with migrants. I'm just curious about how you translate this idea of common sense, and in the context of what you were talking about, the idea of trust and security and securitization. Well, maybe for both of you, Maria and Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, common sense is something also, particularly after in the context of the war, how US president has used this as a descriptor of his approach to the peace as something that is commonsensical, or the embodiment of common sense is something that, of course, should make any critical observer of language and how it does its work in society and politics very apprehensive, and definitely, well, perhaps somewhat suspicious. I mean, I'd say that common sense, of course, is something that is sought to be, when I'm talking about this context that I'm observing, when I'm observing memory laws, for instance, is something that, of course, states would appeal on, but also constantly seek to shape and tweak, right? Because in a way, that might have different names also in different societies, such as, uh, that's the public consciousness, or that's what we are, or I mean, this is something that gets simply essentialized in these processes, and of course, yet it's not something that actually somehow is organically there beyond maybe the intuitive shared something that say is captured in the 10 commandments. That might be the sort of universal common sense in most across most of the world. But generally, it's not politically innocent to talk about common sense or to invoke this trope. It's something that any politician, particularly in an authoritarian system, is very intensely interested in having a say about and having their, hairy hands doing the molding about. So I guess it's true, particularly in these cases where effectively, we have an illiberal authoritarian context of some sort. We can see how these references to the people, of course, are also carried by this very allusion to a common sense of a particular interpretation and thought.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. But then the way it wraps into the shaping of narrative and narrative strategies is something that I think is and especially in terms of memory, the evocation of memory in that. Jennifer, did you want to add, or do you have another thing?
I love I don't love the effect of it, but the way that you're talking about common sense and the power of mobilizing the discourse of common sense, that's intriguing and interesting. I want to kind of put that out there. What I was thinking of, it made me think of Yelena's book, The Yellow Star, Red Star, and the piece she wrote for our special issue. And I've been reading lately UN Security Council debates of the 90s to do the genocide governance, and the invocation every time of the Holocaust and the authoritative way that the camps and memory of World War II. And there's a monolithic memory spoken by all the members of the Security Council of what is World War II, what are concentration camps, what is genocide. And then thinking of that in that sort of height of the liberal order moment. And then in the way that Yelena talks about the appropriation of that imagery for very different ends, and sort of a reworking of the common sense of what the Holocaust was, and where the whose tragedy it was, and how it unites. So I don't necessarily have an answer, but what both of you were talking about made me think about that moment and that switch, and the manipulation of common sense for a totally different kind, to generate a different kind of solidarity, a different kind of inside outside.
Yeah. And of course, when you talk about sort of like the post World War II order and sort of like the ontological insecurity or narratives that are attached to that, like the touchstone for so much of that is built on sort of like the ethical imperatives with like, as you said, that come out of the understanding of the Second World War. And then, but yeah, of course, that narrative only got built up, really late. But yeah, I find it super interesting. I think that it's very, very productive angles for both of you to pursue. I think we're sort of running late. It's 1 o'clock, or it's 1:05. So I would have loved actually to have you had to visit, so that we can discuss over dinner or something like that. But it's virtual, so we can't do that. But yeah, I would really like to thank you both so much for doing this. And I hope that we can continue this conversation somewhere.
Absolutely. Thank you so
much.
much for the invitation. And it's been a delight to be caught up again with Maria's work and to entertain the ideas that you put out there. So thank you so much, Esther.
Thank you so much, both.